Hello everyone, this is Jim with automaticpoker.com, and today I'm going to show you how to build a basic HUD from scratch. Now this HUD would be perfect for somebody just getting started using HUDs, or for someone just looking for something very simple that they can use to get a few reads on their opponents at the tables. Now this HUD can be a starting point for someone and be expanded on later. You can actually put pop-ups into this HUD to gain more expanded reads as you face different situations, and just use this as a springboard to your play. I will be building this HUD using HUD Manager, as you can see on the left hand side here. This is the HUD building feature found within HUD Manager. Once we are done, the HUD we build will look like the one here on the right hand side of your screen. As you can see, we have very few stats, but each one of these stats serves a purpose, and we will go through that as the video continues and as we build the HUD. So hang tight and we'll get started shortly. So if you aren't familiar with what a HUD is, it is an acronym that means Heads Up Display. But basically what it does is it takes all of the statistics that your tracking software tracks during hands and displays pertinent information as to the playing styles of your opponents, and manifests it in a heads-up display on your tables so that you can use that information to make more accurate and better decisions at the poker table, whether it be through reads or through basic mathematical analysis and frequencies. But we're not going to get into all that complicated mumbo jumbo. I'm just going to show you a few stats, tell you exactly how you can use those stats, and show you how to build it here inside HUD Manager, and then you can get off and start playing with your new HUD. Now this HUD will also, I'm assuming, be relevant for use in the other major software out there, which is called Pokertracker. So by using this tutorial, you should be able to also build a HUD within that software as well. But this is my favorite software to use, so that's the one that I'm going to use to show you how to build your HUD. So the first thing that we want to do is choose all of the stats that we want to include in this HUD. Well, the first one we have is VPIP, which is shown right here, and that can be found to your right here under VPIP, and pick total VPIP, and then move it to the left by clicking this button right here, and it will show up right here. The next stat that we want is total preflop raise. So we go to the PFR section here and click total PFR and move it to the left. And the next thing we want to have is what the aggression of our opponents are. So we will find aggression down here. We have to scroll all the way down. We look for post-flop aggression percentage, and there it is. So we move it over. So that is going to be the first line of our HUD. So what we have to do now is create a new line by clicking that, and it puts it right there. And what that does is that just basically drops down the stats to the next line. So the next stat that we want to have is total steal. So we have to go all the way up here until we see steal. We're getting there. Alright, raise first in steal should be right. Click total steal and move it to the left. The next stat we want is total re-steal. Now this is how somebody reacts to a steal and how often they 3-bet that steal. So it should be under the versus steal tab. So now we're looking for total re-steal. So let's move down until we see it. There we go. Total re-steal, 3-bet versus steal. Move it to the left, and we are good to go. Now that's the only two stats we're going to have on our second line. So now we just click new line again, and we go to our next stats, which are going to be total fold to steal, which is in the same place we already were. So we're going to move that over here to the left. And then we're going to choose a post-flop stat, which is fold to flop c-bets. So we just have to find the area that handles versus c-bets. So we'll look down all the way until we see versus continuation bet. Do the drop down menu here, and we're looking for fold to flop c-bet, and there it is. It's the first stat. So we move that over to the left here, and there we go. We have our entire HUD built already. So I'm actually going to put this HUD up over on the right hand side so we can see where we're at so far. So just hold on with me for a second. I got to switch the HUD over. And there we go. This is what our HUD looks like right now. You'll notice that it doesn't look the same as it did before, but don't worry, I'm going to show you how to make the changes to make it look a lot more attractive and easier to read. The first stat is pretty much close to being done, so we'll go ahead and take a look at total VPIP and get that stat adjusted correctly, and then we'll move on to each stat one by one and show you how to do this. So the next thing we need to do is go to the next tab called Stat Appearance, and as you can see, I've already got some colors put in here, so I'm going to go ahead and turn those colors on by clicking this button here. So we're going to use 4 different colors, and I've already got the percentages input right here. So actually that is not correct. We need to get this down to 15. We need to move this one over to 35 and move this one over to 50. Oops. And now we're going to have anybody less than 15% voluntarily putting money into the pot will be blue in color. They'll be color coded. Anybody that does between 15 and 35% will be gray, which is basically average. Anytime I use gray, it's because that's just the average range you would expect. Anybody above 35, we're going to color green, and anyone more than 50, should have, more than 50, will be color coded purple. And purple just basically means extremes, so you can expect an extremely fishy player to have more than 50% VPIP, and somebody that's generally a bad player and has fishy tendencies, I guess, would be somewhere between 35 and 50 VPIP over an extended sample size. So now that we've got that set up, we don't really need to give an abbreviation because we know what the first 3 lines of our HUD are going to be all about. And so the next thing we have to do is click on minimum samples. I always just go with 5 to start. That way when 5 hands are finished on a player, or we have 5 hands of a sample size, we will have a stat manifest right here. Let's check our font, and we are using Comic Sans MS for bold and 16 for font size. Now this can vary depending on your computer, so feel free to change the size to fit your needs. I'm just going with the one that works well on my computer. So what I will do is go ahead and duplicate this on every single stat real quick, and I'll show you. It's very simple. We won't do the colors. Actually, let's just go ahead and get the sizing done now. And let's do that. So 16 Comic Sans. Where is it? There it is. And we're bold and we're done. And then we can apply it. And you can see the sizing is corrected. Now I'm going to go through and go ahead and do all the sizings on all the stats and be right back. So there we go. That took me all of about 30 to 45 seconds to do it, so let's apply and see what we've got. Now we definitely want to change the abbreviations. Sure, you could use these abbreviations and know what you're doing, but it's a little bit over the top, I think. I think we can just assume our top 3 are always going to be VPIP, pre-flop raise, and aggression factor without having to put any kind of abbreviation to the left of it. So let's go ahead and just take those out. It's easy as pie here. So that's our top line now. Now what we need to do is go to our next line and fix these. So this is definitely going to be steel, so we'll just use simply S. I cannot type today. And let's go for the next line. We're going to do resteel, RS. Very easy. And for the bottom line, we're going to go with fold to steel, which I can do that way. And actually, I'm going to do this. I forgot to do that. You don't have to do this. And I am just a terrible typer today. Like this, and like that, and like, I guess that one we may keep the same. Now we'll go to this, fold to C-bet. Okay, let's see what we got. Beautiful. So now we're going to color code these stats by simply taking the colors found here, copying them, Control C, canceling out of there. The first stats, all of the stats except for the bottom 2, generally a lower stat means tighter or more nitty play, I guess. So we'll put the bottom as being blue on everything except the bottom 2 stats. So I'll go ahead and just show you how to do that. Make Control V, Control V, and Control V. And we'll apply. As you can see, we've got some coloration changes right there. So what we need to do is open up 4 levels on each stat as well, so we can color code the rest. I hope I click the right thing there. There we go. There we go. And there we go. Let's make sure. I think we're looking good. The second stat will always be gray for these stats, the first few we've done, so we're just going to leave that one alone. Green will keep the same on VPIP because that's the only stat we use green for, because that shows fishy in nature, and the rest of the stats are all showing passiveness or aggressiveness in general, so we won't need green for anything but the VPIP. However, we will need the color red. Now, we don't have a red created yet, so we'll have to do that ourselves here. So what we can do is just pick a red. Let's find something that's a little bit pleasing to the eyes. Let's see, something like, I like to go with the lighter colors, it's just easier on the eyes. Something like that. We'll Control C it, we'll add it to that one, and then we'll go down and make that the third stat on our next few stats. Boom, boom, boom. Actually, I think it works for just about every one of them. Go there, and there, and we'll apply. Alright, so we've got red now, and I think for the last stat on preflop raise we're going to have to go with purple. So we have a purple already, so we'll just use the one up here. Control C, Control V, and the same thing for aggression. We'll go Control V, and total steal, Control V, all the way down, every single stat. We'll do the bottom 2 last here, but I think we're done with our first few stats here. What is that, 5 stats? So we'll apply. So those stats are color coded now. We do have to change the numbers in them, but let's go ahead and get the color coding done on the last 2 stats. So we're going to go ahead and need purple for the first stat, which is this one. And that just shows extreme. They fold to steal in an extreme way. They fold to flop c-bet in an extreme way. That's basically what that purple means there. So we'll go with purple. We will need red for the next stat. It's more like a pink, isn't it? But I guess that's good enough. So we'll put that there, and that there. We'll leave gray for the next one, but we will need blue for the last one because that means they are doing it often. They're folding to steal often, which means they're generally a tight, straightforward player, so we want them to be color-coded blue. Same thing for fold to c-bet. If they're folding to c-bet often, we want them blue. So we're done with our colors. Now all we have to do is do the correct numbering system. So we already have 15, 35, 50. For pre-flop raise, we will use 10, 20, and 35. For post-flop aggression, we'll use 30, 40, and 50. For total steal, we're going to go with 20, 30, and 40. Very basic and standard here. And for re-steal, we're going to go with 6, because that would be an extremely tight 3-betting range. We'll go with 10, which between 6 and 10 is a pretty average 3-betting, or re-stealing range, that is. And anything between 10 and 15 would be fairly aggressive. Anything more than 15 is really aggressive, so we'll stick with that. And for total fold to steal, we're going to go with 40, 55, and 70. And for the last stat here, we're going to go with 40, 50, and 70. Okay, we're looking good here. So the last thing we have to do here is unclick display for hero on each stat. But that's a personal preference of mine. I don't necessarily need to know my session stats for myself, but that's, I mean, if you want to have that, that's fine as well. So I just go ahead and unclick these real quick for you, and I'll also add in the sample size of 5, and we'll also click dim for sample size, which I don't really think does anything, but I click it anyway because if the stat looks a little bit dimmer, maybe we'll realize that the sample size is pretty small and plan accordingly. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So we are done, and we can click apply, and we'll see what we got here. Look, does that HUD not look similar to what we started with earlier on in the video? So let's just make sure everything looks good. All of our numbers look good. All of our abbreviations look good. If you have a HUD pop-up, you can add it right here. Now I am not going to cover pop-ups in this video because it's a little bit advanced. However, we will cover that in a future video on a more advanced HUD, but you certainly could add pop-ups to this. And the one, I said I wasn't going to cover this, but just to show you, the one that I like to use is a pop-up I created, and I call it the positional versus hero HUD. And when you hover over, it shows you what every player does against the hero and versus the field in all positional 3-bet spots. And I may show you how to build this in a different video, but it is beyond the scope of this one, so we won't do that. But that's just a little tip for you there if you wanted to start using that. So the last thing we're going to do is go through each stat, and I will tell you briefly, in a nutshell, how to use each stat when you are playing at the poker table. The first stat we have is VPIP. Now VPIP is generally a good indication of the playing style of your opponents. If you have a VPIP below the 15 range, you can expect your opponent to be a really extremely tight player, so when he gets involved in a hand, you can expect his range to be very narrow and consist of much stronger hands than, say, a much higher VPIP player would have. The average VPIP is somewhere between that 15 range and 35 range, but most players nowadays are in the low 20s, as you can see on this table right here. Generally, players are getting involved about 1 in 5 times on average, not positionally, but on average if you take all hands into account. The second stat is pre-flop raise, and this is basically just an indicator how often a player is raising versus calling. This player here, he never calls, he only raises or folds. That's a really good bit of information for you to have, because if that player happened to call in a hand, it's out of the ordinary, and you might expect that to sometimes be a trap. So the normal gap is somewhere around 5%. As you can see, it's pretty close to that on just about every one of these tables. This table is mostly consisting of regulars, I think. The only loose or fishy type player we might have is this player down here, who has a 40 VPIP, which is green in color, as I showed you how to set up. And he has a low pre-flop raise. Not extremely low, but low just the same. So this player is mostly calling and not doing very much raising, which is generally a losing style of poker. So now that we have established how to tell the regs from the aggressive regs, from the tight regs to the fishy players, let's move on to the aggression factor. Now this is a post-flop stat, this last one here. The higher that number, the more aggressive you can expect your opponent to be. So if a player with a very low aggression factor, like this player here of 25, you would expect when he bets or raises post-flop, he's going to have a strong range. He's not going to be bluffing that often. If a player is somewhere in the middle, he's probably fairly balanced between bluffs and value bets. And if somebody is over the top aggressive, like this player here with a 61, you could expect the majority of his bets, or a large portion of his bets, to be bluffs or semi-bluffs after the flop. So you can adjust your play accordingly after the flop based on your opponent's aggression. Let's move on to the next line, where we have steal and re-steal. Now this is a very important component, because a lot of the play in No Limit Hold'em, especially in 6 max, is going to revolve around stealing and re-stealing situations. So the first stat we have is how often overall a person will steal on average from the sum of the cutoff, the button, and the small blind. So what we have is, for example, this player is 34. Now most people steal tighter from the cutoff, looser from this button, and then some players are even looser from the small blind, but most are generally about the same as their button range from the small blind, but maybe even a little bit tighter. So if I saw this player here with a 34, I would expect him to be raising from the cutoff somewhere in the 28 to 30% range, from the button somewhere from the 36 to 46%, or I'm sorry, the 36 to 40% range, and in the small blind maybe somewhere in the 34 32 range. That would be my initial impression of this player. And for this player here with a 44% steal, I would expect him to remain fairly tight in the cutoff, something maybe in the 30 to 35% range, but from the button and small blind, I would expect this player to be somewhere over 50%. Maybe 50, 55% from the button, maybe even 50, 55, 60% from the small blind as well. And actually we can test this. Let's open up his stats with a pop-up, which I said I would not cover, but we can just do this for a little exercise here. So this player is indeed stealing from the cutoff 30%, the button 52%, and the small blind 63%. So I was not too far off on my reads of this player's positional stats just based on this one steal stat alone. So now let's say we are the player who is stealing from the cutoff button or small blind. We can take a look at our opponent's re-steal range, which is this right here. Now an average stat would be somewhere in this 10%. Aggressive stat would be somewhere in the 13 to 15%. Anything over 10 but less than 15 is fairly aggressive. Anything over 15 is starting to get unbalanced and a little bit over the top, and you can start adjusting majorly to that type of stat. But it works the same way as it does for when we are re-stealing. So if we are in the cutoff and our cutoff range is indeed a little bit tighter than our button range, we can expect this player to only be re-stealing maybe 6-7% versus the cutoff, but maybe 12-13% versus the button, and so on and so forth. Exactly the same thing for each player. Now this player down here, I want to give you a little tip, is when you see a 5% re-stealing range, he probably is not adjusting positionally. He's probably between 3 and 5% versus all stealing positions, and that's just the way tight players operate. They're going to have their linear 3-betting range that is only going to consist of tight hands, something like 10s plus, maybe ace queen suited plus, and that's probably somewhere in the 5% range. And if you don't believe me, I'll just drag in a poker stove here. 10s plus ace queen is exactly 5%. Well, it's 4.7%, but beggars cannot be choosers, right? So now let's look at the last line which we have, which is probably, in my opinion, maybe the most important line of all. We have the fold to steal, and we have the fold to c-bet. Now this can control a lot of your pre-flop ranges, especially in the steal spots, and also control a lot of your post-flop lines. If you know how often a person is folding the c-bets, you can plan accordingly. The player on the top left is folding the steals really often, over 70%. Actually, just about everybody at this table folds the steals fairly often. So in general, unless one of these players is going just crazy with this 3-betting or calling and becoming a post-flop station, you can open really wide. This person is a razor fold, so I think you can just profitably steal 100% against this player most of the time. Sure, he's going to be 3-betting when he doesn't fold, and it's going to seem like he's 3-betting a lot, but the times that he folds the steals will almost make, well, in fact, might make your steal a free roll versus him, and you can just only commit pre-flop with your strong range versus a 15% or whatever positionally you have figured out, and otherwise just play straightforward and not have to worry too much about ever getting exploited. It's when you run into players that are folding the steals less than your average percent. Well, this player is only folding 56%, which is still high enough that you can open a fairly wide stealing range. But you do have to take that into consideration that you're going to see a lot of flops when you have this player behind you. So if he is on the button and you are on the cutoff, you're going to be playing out of position often, so you may want to tighten your cutoff range when he is on the button. So the last thing we're going to cover is fold to c-bet, and I think this is pretty straightforward for most people that have been playing poker. Is the lower somebody's c-bet range, you have to adjust your value and bluffing range accordingly. If somebody folds less often, you can widen your value range, and if somebody folds more often, you can widen your bluffing range. And it's pretty straightforward. Now this doesn't say anything about position, but you can expect that most people will have a wider check folding range than they will a folding range in position. So I would expect this player to maybe check fold to c-bet somewhere around 50-55, and maybe fold to c-bet in position somewhere around 40%. Now these are not hard and fast numbers, but this is just one of the things you can do at the table to make adjustments against players. Remember, we always want to think about frequencies and how different positions affect things. And while you could just lay out every single position and every single situation in your HUD, things would become so hectic and so complicated that you may suffer from something I call paralysis of analysis. Besides, there's so much more into playing a poker hand correctly than exactly what your opponent is doing. A lot of it is about board textures, how you play your ranges on those board textures, whether you are in position or not, and any recent history you may have against your opponents. So a lot of these stats should be taken with a grain of salt if there is some other factor that may alter the way they are playing besides just what their exact bland history is versus the field and how they react to the field. Because remember, you are not the field. You are your own individual player, and these are each individual players who will be reacting differently and adjusting just as you are adjusting your play. Many of them will be doing so also. So always keep in mind. So if there's ever an argument for using a simple HUD just to get a basic idea of what people are doing, that is probably the best one I can think of. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and for those of you that have never used a HUD before, I hope this gives you an opportunity to start improving your play by understanding exactly how to use a HUD, and also why it is not necessary to spend too much time trying to build some complicated HUD. Now, don't get me wrong, there is a time and a place, there's a style of play, and there are particular games that is to your advantage to have more stats than what are showing on this HUD, but that we can cover in a separate video and a much more advanced video than is the scope of this video. So thanks again, everybody, for watching. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel. I will leave some links in the description below to show you where you can learn more about Hold'em Manager, Pokertracker, and HUDs in general, as well as links to my website, which you can find a lot more information about all of this stuff. Everybody enjoy the rest of their day and take care.